Hello everyone, this is Mel here from Sneakers Corner back again. So this is part 2 of what I'm going to be calling Muhammad's Mausoleum thesis. If you haven't seen part 1, it was titled Where Was Muhammad Buried? And I would advise you to first take a look at that video before you look at this one, so it all makes sense. In addition to that, I would definitely advise you all to look at the video to do with Umar being Muhammad, which I have linked in part 1. So just make sure you've seen both of those before you see this one. So the title of the video today is The Significance of the Dome of the Rock's Octagonal Shape. And this is based on a suggestion by one of the viewers who pointed out the significance of the octagonal shape in churches. And I found an interesting website with lots of information around this, whose source I will give during the video. And the video is largely based on that, so I can't really take any credit for this, but the only thing I'll be adding to it really is applying it to the Dome of the Rock, essentially. Now, another viewer reminded me of this very relevant tombstone inscription, which is found in Jerusalem. The inscription of Abasa in Jerusalem, which contains the date 691 AD, which of course is around the time that the Dome of the Rock was being built. And it relates to the tragic nature of Muhammad's death, and it appears to be remembered locally in Jerusalem. At least that's my interpretation of it. It says, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, the greatest calamity of the people of Islam is that which has fallen them on the death of Muhammad the Prophet. May God grant him peace. This is the tomb of Abasa, daughter of Juraj, son of whatever." So, interesting that there's a reference to the tragic death of Muhammad. Now, again, I just point out that a number of videos that I've done on the idea of Muhammad being Umar and Umar being Muhammad, which was Joe's original idea, Joe from Red Judaism, whose channel doesn't seem to be in operation at the moment. Hopefully it'll be back soon. But that was his idea, not taking credit for it. I just developing from there, and I'm developing from both Paul Ellis's work on the Jerusalem thesis and also Odin Lafontaine's similar work, which was pointing towards Jerusalem. So that's sort of the context of all of this. Now, it's my strong sense that the one place where traditions are remembered are locally. So if something happens in a place, it's often remembered much better there than anywhere else. Whereas outside of that area, the story tends to either be forgotten or distorted. So it's interesting that refers in, taking that into account, to the greatest calamity of the people of Islam is that which has fallen them on the death of Muhammad the Prophet. Now, we mentioned in part 1 the evidence for the idea that Umar, or Muhammad, was stabbed, and that it took him 3 days to die, and that I believe during those 3 days he made it clear to his followers that he wanted to be buried under the most holy place in his eyes, which is the Masjid al-Haram, i.e. the Temple Mount. Paul Ellis has very strongly argued the case that that's one and the same place. And in the last video I pointed out where I believe this was, which is a little cave called the Well of Souls, which is under the Dome of the Rock. And I pointed out a marble corner area in that cavern which had 2 pillars there above the marble casing. those pillars appear to be redundant, seeing as the cave supports its own weight quite happily. It didn't need those pillars there. And it raises our curiosity as to what exactly is in that corner box. I'm struck with the idea that in the scripture it talks about Jesus being the cornerstone, and it's interesting that in terms of the symbolism there, it suggests that this is the cornerstone. You know, it's literally in the corner of the cave is the suggestion in terms of the location, which is a very odd place to put something. Why is it in the corner? I would suggest that maybe if Muhammad is buried there, that there was a symbolic reason for putting it in the corner, not maybe put it in the center, that it's to do with making it suggest that Umar is the cornerstone, the foundation of the temple, as it were. Now, so we also got this other note from a viewer, and apologies to the viewers, I haven't put in your online names, and it's partially because of the nature of the work we're doing. But if you're happy to have your names associated, you know, your online names, please place that under the video. I'm not trying to not acknowledge you, but I'm obviously conscious of the fact that some people don't necessarily want their name associated with this. So this viewer has said the following: this is a long shot regarding those columns in that cavern, but looking at new Project Gutenberg releases of old text, a book about the Knights Templars published in 1842, tells of the attack on Jerusalem in 1244. The Sultan of Egypt was using mercenaries from the defunct Khwarezmian Empire, who seemed to have become barbarous and coarse due to their brutal conquest by the Mongols. And these men, as part of their conquest of Jerusalem, treated the Christians wretchedly, and to humiliate them did various abominable things. The vice master of the temple reported, "They have taken away indeed the sculptured columns which were placed as a decoration before the sepulchre of the Lord, and as a mark of victory, and as a taunt to the Christians, they have sent them to the sepulchre of the wicked Muhammad." Now, where is the sepulchre of the wicked Muhammad? It doesn't say. But just across the valley is that cavern that we mentioned. Would they have gone to the effort of bringing these pillars all the way down to Medina just to shove it in the faces of Christians? Or would they have just brought it across the valley to the tomb that I mentioned? I think if they're trying to taunt the Christians, it would make more sense if Muhammad's sepulchre was in Jerusalem. Because how else are the Christians going to be even aware of where they brought these pillars, these decorated pillars? I think it makes more sense if we assume that that's what happened. So, on to the main topic today. Why was the Dome of the Rock built with an octagonal shape? So the Dome of the Rock was begun in 684 AD, some 150 years after the octagonal scheme was generally introduced in the Near and Middle East. Its design could have been due to building on the foundation of an earlier Byzantine church, but this doesn't seem to have been necessitated by that, as there were two earlier wooden masjids which were rectangular in shape. So even though, okay, that's one explanation, it doesn't have to have been the case that they built it in an octagonal shape. It could be that it was intended to mimic the church that existed between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, known as the Church of the Kathisma, which also has a rock featured at its centre. So that's, I think, probably getting closer to the reason, but maybe there's even a further reason. The Dome of the Rock's design, however, could have been intended with the particular purpose as a mausoleum for Muhammad, and perhaps this shape fits with that very well. The dome, which is the Dome of the Rock, was placed over As-Sakra, the rock, on the supposed geographical position where the Prophet Muhammad ended his night journey to Jerusalem and ascended to heaven. Now, this phrase, night journey, obviously the reference comes from the Quran, but perhaps this is being very hypothetical and speculative now for a moment. Perhaps Muhammad's last 3 days when he was wounded, or Umar we're talking about here, he was wounded by a sword, perhaps that was referred to as his night journey. And at the end of this night journey, he ascended to heaven according to their beliefs. And where did he ascend from? From this spot, which also happens to be the place where I believe he was buried. So that kind of makes some logical sense. It doesn't seem to make sense for him to be buried in Medina and then ascend to heaven from Jerusalem. That kind of seems to be a contradiction. Now, what is a baptistry? The architecture of the baptistry as a location for the baptismal rite has specific significance within the history of building. In ancient times, the term was related to a basin, a pool, or other place of bathing. The Latin term baptisterium pointed originally to a vessel which contained water for baptism. The act of baptism is a sacrament which is widely used in a number of beliefs. The inauguration by water is an old custom with a very elementary human background. It can be expected that the form of the building in which such a sacrament took place reflected that elementary character. You can see here the source that I've used for this information, which I strongly recommend you take a look at. It goes on to say, the ecclesiastical writer Tertullian, born probably 160 AD at Carthage, gave in his treatise on baptism the outlines of the baptismal rite. Happy is our sacrament of water, in that by washing away the sins of our earthly blindness, we are set free and admitted into eternal life. Now, notice the Christian belief is that after death we enter eternal life. The Empedocletian element, water, is the fourth and last undividable unit in the sequence fire, air, earth, and water. You probably are aware the fifth element is ether, and that's sometimes called the quintessence. Our present quadralectic interpretation places the element of water in the fourth quadrant, paying a tribute to the multiplicity of the visible. Water is always related to quantity and often to movement as well. From a biological point of view, the watery is our primeval environment. We are born in the all-embracing presence of fluid, even before air could feed our lungs. Therefore, our invisible roots are closely related to water, and the act of baptism is just a remembrance of that early stage. The numerological significance of the architecture of baptistries. The architecture of baptistries and fonts often had a symbolic meaning which was expressed, probably more than in other forms of building, in a numerological language. The evolution of church floor plans. Davies, 1962, studied the architectural setting of baptism and noted that the earliest baptistries of the 3rd and 4th centuries were square or rectangular, with or without an apse at one end. They can be found in Egypt, Greece, North Africa, Palestine and Syria, and persisted until the 7th century. In other areas like France and Italy, the quadrilateral outline changed into a round or octagonal plan from the middle of the 5th century onwards. The evolution of the ground plan from a circular outlay, see number 1 there in the diagram, to the cross, number 2, which actually, if you look at a lot of churches, you'll find that it's in that cruciform shape with the aisle running down the middle and so on. Then number 3, the square, and it finds its apoptosis in the octagonal and polygonal features of the ground plan, as we see in number 4. Subsequently, the quadratic circle is round again when the polygonal scheme merges with the circle in a new first quadrant. So it kind of goes from number 4 back to 1 again, essentially. I want to point out, in case it's not clear, so this octagonal shape, number 4, is associated with water. So it is associated with baptistries typically, but it also has 2 other significance and meaning, which we'll look at later. Now, the history of the Lateran baptistry in Rome reflects these modifications upon a single site. The original baptistry from the early 4th century had a square outline. It was enlarged around 350 AD and transformed into a circle with 8 columns along its interior walls. The structure became known as the Constantinian baptistry. A pronaos, or porch, and apologies for my pronunciation as always, was added in 432 to 440 AD under the inspiration of Pope Sixtus III, and the circle was changed into an octagon. The building became an example for many similar round cylindrical halls or octagonal buildings. Does that look similar to the interior of the Dome of the Rock? So, have a look at the similarity between the Dome of the Rock there on the left and the baptistry found in Rome. As you can see, this is clearly a common Christian design that Abdul al-Malik simply just borrowed. It's a Byzantine style. Okay. Here's a picture of the interior of the baptistry of St. John Lateran in Rome. Now, moving on, the significance of the number 8. 8 is the first cubic number, 2 to the power of 3. According to Martinaz's Capella, is a complete number. The number 8 has this property both in a geometrical and arithmetical sense. Already the early Christians used an octagonal font because it pointed to resurrection and eternity. Gregory the Great knew the Eastern symbolic meaning of 8 as a connection with eternity. There is, for this very reason, a close relationship in architectural treatment between the baptistries, materia, which is related to martyrs, and funerary monuments. It was on the 8th day that Jesus rose from the dead. The theme of death and resurrection was related to baptismal regeneration. And I do want to point out that Gregory the Great was Pope in the early part of the 7th century. So this kind of reinforces the idea that this idea of the octagonal shape was very much in the mind of Christians at that time. So the 3 things I want to emphasize is the connection with baptism, martyrs, and as a funeral monument. The Dome of the Rock looks a lot like a mausoleum for Muhammad. Given as we are suggesting that Umar/Muhammad was buried in the crypt under the Dome of the Rock, then its octagonal shape is very appropriate. It links with resurrection, eternity, materia, and funeral monuments in a Byzantine context. The inscriptions that run overhead now read like the words on a mausoleum for Muhammad. So if you look at the inner arcade, I'm not going to read all of it, but notice what precedes the reference to Muhammad, referring to Allah or God. He quickens and he gives death, and he has power over all things. Muhammad is a servant of God and his messenger. So Muhammad is referred to in the context of death, mortality. Lo, God and his angels shower blessings on the Prophet. And it says, ye who believe, ask blessings on him and salute him with a worthy salutation. So it's in this context, if we just look at in isolation, it appears to be there as a memorial to Muhammad's death and asking for visitors to pray for him, ask blessings on him, and to salute him with a worthy salutation. A worthy salutation, I would suggest, would be to pray for him. And then it continues, the blessing of God be on him, referring to Muhammad, and peace be on him, and may God have mercy. So peace on him, rest in peace, may God have mercy on his soul. It all fits with the idea of it being the site of his burial. And notice that the inscriptions run around the outside, overlooking the rock, the sacra, and underneath that sacra is that cave. So it fits perfectly. If we look at the outer arcade, it says, Muhammad is the messenger of God. Lo, God and his angels shower blessings on the Prophet. Again, the idea of Muhammad being prayed for. And ye who believe, ask blessings on him and salute him with a worthy salutation, which would be to pray for him. I would suggest that it's all about praying for the dead Muhammad, asking for God's mercy on him, and so on. We can see similarities with more recent mausoleums like that devoted to Lenin. As we know, Lenin had a massive mausoleum built for him, and also for Stalin. His body was exposed and people came in lines to visit the body. There we can see a picture of Lenin with the body of Stalin to the right. It was viewed annually by thousands of tourists in Moscow. Can we imagine people heading down into the crypt underneath the Dome of the Rock to pray for Muhammad? Perhaps doing a few circles upstairs under the arcade, remembering him, going around praying in circles, and then going down to visit him. And we saw the star shape on the tiles in the last video where the pilgrims could have knelt and prayed for him. Okay, obviously this is long before the Abbasids disproved of the idea of going to pray at people's graves and so on. Okay. So these function to keep the dream alive after the founder has died. The purpose is that the ideologue is dead, but the ideology lives on, and that's really the function of having a Dome of the Rock dedicated to Muhammad. It's totally different from other mosques. It wasn't built to hold large numbers of people. It was meant to be a dignified place that Muslims could go and visit the remains of Muhammad and have a quiet moment down below. And it was never intended for large crowds in there. And that was the reason behind it. It wasn't the function of it to be a regular mosque. It was meant to be something else. So my conclusion, and as I say, it's tentative, and this is still the early stage of the research. It's a hypothesis. I suppose we could use the word thesis because there's quite a bit of evidence, but I think we'll stick with it's a hypothesis at this stage. If Muhammad was buried in Jerusalem, given the confusion over the first 2 centuries of Islam due to the destruction of Umayyad era records and widespread misinformation, it is conceivable that a supposed location for Muhammad's burial site in Medina could have been quite happily accepted by the masses. It is also conceivable that a faint memory of Muhammad's, i.e. Umar's, true resting place in Jerusalem was retained until the time of the Crusades. Thank you for watching.